Hi, everyone. I am here. We're back again because we were on last night with Reverend John Brown, Father John Brown, and he is a Jesuit. He is from the Society of Jesus, and he's a priest, and he's Catholic. And he's with us today to talk about some really important things. Like we're going to talk a little bit about the Mardi Gras because he happens to be from New Orleans. We're going to talk about culture a little bit. We'll maybe talk about the Catholic Church and what the Catholic Church has that really differentiates it from maybe some of the other Christian denominations. And we'll go from there. So welcome, Father Brown.
Thank you for having me back on. I apologize for cutting everything short yesterday.
Oh, no worries at all. So actually, let's begin right where we left off yesterday, because this is fantastic that you're here. I don't think I've ever done it where I was on the night before, and then the next day we got to follow up. So the Mardi Gras. So I don't know very much about the Mardi Gras.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask you about its relationship to the Catholic Church, because I know obviously it takes place just before our Lenten season. And so it's in recognition in a way of Ash Wednesday. So what do you think about it? You're from New Orleans, and
well, it's really I always think of Mardi Gras as kind of a tale of two Mardi Gras, right? There are the state of Louisiana has an incredibly strong, especially the southern part of the state, has a very strong sense of Mardi Gras because it's such a Catholic part of the state. The southern part of Louisiana is very Catholic. But the people in New Orleans and the people out in the Cajun country, which is where I was born and raised, have a different sense of Mardi Gras and what it all means. So maybe I'll talk about the country Mardi Gras a little bit. It's going to sound strange, but I'll talk about that and then get to the part of New Orleans. So, so there's this sense in the world that we've all lost. We do not understand, and we didn't grow up thinking about it consciously, but really up until just a few hundred years ago, the whole world considered, I'm going to use a fancy word, apotropaic, right? Apotropaic magic was an important thing, meaning kind of warding off demons. So think of like Greek, apo means away, and tropos means to turn. So like you're turning away the evil spirits in the world, right? You're sending them away. And the way that really, again, people up until pretty recently did that was they often did it by trying to scare away the evil with more scary things. So think of a gargoyle on the corner of a building, or on the corner of even churches. Some churches even have gargoyles, right? This scary statue of this demonic looking beast that's really meant, and it's always outward facing, it's meant to scare away the demons and not let them come in, right? So a lot of, sort of country folks had that in their kind of conscious whenever they would put on masks and crazy costumes and try to scare away the evil spirits. And then that itself became fun, right? It was kind of fun to put on a scary mask and to go and scare away all the demons and make them go away. It's a folk practice, right? It's not exactly part of the theology of the Catholic Church or anything like that, but it's definitely a folk practice that has roots in Christians, certainly in the life of many Christians for many centuries, but also those roots I'm sure have influence from their pagan root, have pagan roots as well. And this idea of before you fast, that you should feast a little bit before you fast comes from has Jewish roots as well. This plays itself out in the Cajun people in ways that I think most people would be shocked by, right? So a lot of the people around where I'm from will dress up in these crazy costumes, big sort of wild costumes, wild masks. There's sort of a traditional look to them. I can recognize it from a mile away, right? But they ride horses or march from house to house and beg for the ingredients for a gumbo, right? And they sing little traditional songs in French. And often the people who are in the house will ask the person at their house in the costume, they'll say, you have to dance if you want a bag of rice. You have to dance if you want 5 cents. You have to dance if you want one of my chickens, to make a gumbo. And so it's a lot of dancing. It's a lot of silliness. It's a lot of goofiness that you do all kind of little things, and you try to scare the kids a little bit and all that sort of stuff. And when it's time for you to receive their gift, sometimes, let's say it's a chicken, they'll cut that chicken loose, and everybody has to chase that chicken and catch it, right? And if you catch the chicken, you're the hero of the day. And a lot of that has to do is that the next day is going to be the very next day is going to be Ash Wednesday, where a lot of fasting happens. So a lot of people would give up using fat for Lent. They would give up cooking with fat for Lent. So they would say, well, we need to use up all the fat before Lent starts, right? So we'll have a big feast where we cook with fat, we do all kind of stuff. You know, we're gonna feast on everything so we don't waste it, because it's not gonna last until after Easter, right? So we use it all up, right, and on that day before. So it's a day of a lot of excesses. It seems like a lot of excesses, but in fact, it's sort of like making sure you don't waste anything, right? And a lot of silliness and craziness. In New Orleans, it's a little bit different. In New Orleans, the idea is these are where very typically more wealthy people will dress up in costumes and parade down the streets, giving away what they have to the poor who might need it, in anticipation of these more lean times, giving away their extra to the poor. So they wear masks so as to hide their identity, so that they don't get credit for the good that they're doing. They don't get credit for the acts of charity that they're doing. So Mardi Gras today looks like, in New Orleans at least, you see these people in masks riding on floats and tossing people what, sort of trinkets that look like jewelry, right? And so they toss sometimes doubloons, little plastic doubloons to people, fancy beads and cups and things like that. And so that's kind of like that's the root, that's the base of all this. And so you have these Mardi Gras crews, they call them, the crew of Hermes, the crew of Rex, the crew of whatever, that get together and kind of all year long plan for how they're going to be sort of these I don't know what you want to call it. That'd be super charitable during this time to all these people who line the streets and yell out to them, "Throw me something, mister, give me a little something." And the people on the floats throw them something from that float.
That's really, really interesting, and a different way to look at it, because it definitely is a time of excess, if you'd say that. And just this idea, I heard at first when they were throwing the beads out that they would throw glass beads out, so they were even a little more fancy.
So there have been people that have been known to throw real jewelry in the middle of all so they throw tons and tons of little plastic beads, but then sometimes they'll throw even real jewelry, just as like once in a while somebody will get something spectacular, So
wow.
It's yeah.
No, that's pretty neat, and it's definitely unique because, and actually, it was funny because I told you yesterday, I was sitting in my office reading the magazine that I have here. One of my students came by and said, "What are you reading that? That doesn't look like the kind of magazine that a professor reads." And I thought, well, yeah, sure it is. It's really interesting. And they compared it to Gasparilla here in Tampa. So.
Are you in Tampa? I didn't realize you were in Tampa. I lived in Tampa for a couple of years. I worked at Jesuit High School there in Tampa. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
neat.
Right.
So,
I taught there. Yeah.
can you talk, because I have, even though I've lived here since 2007, I have actually never been to the Gasparilla, which is maybe totally pathetic, but I just I just figured it's probably so wild, and if I bumped into my students, it wouldn't be good. And
I felt the same way when I was teaching there. Yes, I was right there on Himes Avenue, very close to Raymond James Stadium. So I was kind of right in the middle of a lot of the festivities. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. So when you taught, even going back to way back when you were teaching over here, and then also just now with the students, and I have two sons who are in high school, one's a junior and one's a senior. Do you see today as being much more of a challenge than maybe the 80s and the 90s were? Because I grew up in the 80s. I'm a child of the 80s. And
yeah, so I was born in 75. So my young childhood was in the 80s. I was in high school by 1990, Yeah, I do see a whole lot of challenges, right? I see a whole lot of challenges. I think during my time, at least, there was a decrease in the use of drugs and alcohol. I don't know why, but part of the culture just kind of said, let's calm down on all that stuff. Let's back off of some of it. I think that okay, this is sort of a hot take, and I don't mean to disparage anybody for what they do or anything like that, but I think maybe at least during my time, it was very prevalent among young people to feel like mom and dad don't care about me. It was the age of latchkey kids. It was the age of, I don't get enough attention from my parents. They don't love me enough or whatever. Right. So a lot of times if you listen to the music, a lot of it is that, is that sort of grunge rock of like, yeah, everything kind of stinks, whatever.
Yeah.
And everything's, yeah. So it was almost kind of like cool to be neglected in some ways. Right. I think that right now there's just a different demon to fight now, is that I think a lot of the guys now my age, they are now dads, and they don't want to be like their parents. So they are super involved with their kids. They are very involved with their kids. Like, it kind of, there was the age of helicopter parents, which came after my cohort, if you want to call it that, the age of helicopter parents. And now it's the age of lawnmower parents, where they're like, I'm going to be flying solo. I'm going to clear everything up. I used to give my students the speech, and I would say, look, when you're in elementary school, it's perfectly appropriate for your parents to be very involved and to want to know what you have for homework and to try to help you with that homework and to do all these different things to sort of like be a part of your life and all that stuff. And as you mature, you have to get ready for that time when you go off to college, where if your parents try to intervene when you're in college, it's going to do more harm than good. So how do so the big speech for high school is, how do you go from very appropriate to have your parents involved to not appropriate to having your parents involved? How are we going to get there, right? There has to be a progress here. And then I think a lot of kids graduate thinking, no, I do want my parents involved in my college life. I do want them helping me choose what classes I'm going to take. I do want them calling my professor if I don't like my grade or whatever, maybe you've experienced some of that. But
I have.
Yeah. So like that would have been unthinkable for me when I was, 18 years old, to think that my parents were going to somehow intervene, like that would have been absolutely unthinkable,
Oh, completely unthinkable for me too. And my parents never intervened. I mean, never at all intervened. But I've seen, because I was associate dean in my college for 5 years. And so I definitely have seen some parental interventions and some phone calls.
Yeah.
And so some still are involved, but that actually, because I saw that, I decided that I would not be like that. So that's the last thing I do.
Right.
I just let the kids they pick their classes in high school. I'm letting them do everything. And so
I think there's something healthy about that. I do. You can go to any extreme, right? But I do think there's something healthy about that. It reminds me when I was a little kid, and I went to a Catholic elementary school. When I was a little kid, my older sister would take me to school, and she brought me to school late so many times because she was always fixing her hair and putting on her makeup before school, and we were late for school a number of times. And finally, one of the nuns gave me after school detention because I showed up late for school so many times. And so my mom wrote a note to the nun. Didn't tell me about this at all, but she wrote a note to the nun, to the sister who was the principal of the school. And she sealed it up in an envelope, and she said, "You bring this to sister," And in that note, it said, "Sister, I'm not against you punishing, John for being late for school. I fully support everything you want to do. I appreciate discipline, all this kind of stuff. But all that I ask is that you don't hold it against John, because it's not his fault. It's his older sister's fault." So I don't know what it is. I bring it to school. I give the note to the nun. And then after I serve my after school detention, she gives me another note back. It's sealed up in an envelope. I don't know what it is. I go home and I give it to my mom. I found out about this like a decade and a half later, but I go home and my mom gets the note back. And when she opens it up, it's her same note, but everything is corrected for grammar and spelling in red ink. So
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
No, that's a good nun with a sense of. I went to a Catholic grade school too, by the way. I went to and a Catholic high school my freshman year. It was an all girls Catholic high school, but then I switched over to public high school because I wanted the co-ed thing. But that was interesting with the nuns. I don't know. Do they at the Jesuit high school these days? Because I just don't hear as much about nuns anymore, except for maybe ones in nunneries, I guess you call them, or
convents,
places.
Yeah.
So where are the nuns still involved in teaching?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of them are. I mean, look, I think a lot of, so a few things to remember about like religious life within Catholicism, right? There are very, very big orders and very small orders. And so, since the 1970s, early 1970s, everybody's been shrinking, right? Everybody's been getting smaller. And so some of those orders that were already relatively small practically disappeared, almost disappeared. Some of them did disappear, but a lot of them just got so small. There's 8 or 9 of them left or whatever, and they're the same ones that were around from the 70s, so they're going to die out. There are other orders like the Jesuits that were just so big that we could absorb that contraction and still be big and still have, there's still a lot of us, right? So there are a lot of Jesuits here at the school that I work at right now. They have 8 Jesuits that live here on campus and work in the school and all that kind of stuff. I don't know of any other Catholic school in town run by nuns or run by other priests of other orders or anything like that has anything close to that,
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I'm also just thinking about Catholicism itself versus, say, because I told you I was 10 years as a Protestant. And so I saw that the Protestant outlook. And a couple of things I like about Catholicism is it answered the atheists who were always telling me, they said, "Oh, well, there's 40,000 different denominations. Until you guys get your act together, we're not going to follow any of that kind of stuff. I mean, I had some tell me that, and I thought to
Yeah.
myself, it would be so nice if we had sort of a centralized system.
Imagine.
And then I'm looking over at the Catholics, from across the room saying, wait a second, they've got that
Yeah.
hierarchy. And then I
Yeah.
thought, and I just, the beauty of it all. And I like the mass and the sacrifice and the call to fast. Like today, I'm not eating meat. And I stopped eating
Right.
meat on Fridays a while ago when I figured out that that's what a lot of Catholics do. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to say, do you see Catholicism, because we have had troubles in the 90s, like you said, and even at Fatima, Mother Mary predicted we'd have troubles. And she predicted even before that in these other apparitions that we were going to have troubles in this last century as a Catholic Church. So I'm wondering, do you see us on a trajectory going in the future, like for the next, say, 50 years? Do you see it getting worse or better? Or how do you see the church
It's
going?
the end of the world.
Yeah, that's the question.
It's the end of the world. No, I mean, okay, so here's what I honestly believe about all that, right? The world kind of works in these cycles, right? Where you have these big, the rise and the fall of different things. I mean, if you think about even today, we're still talking about the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. There are things that happen that affect the entire world, and more things affect the entire world now in a way that they affected major parts of the known world before, right? So things were happening in Europe that didn't matter at all to the Americas, for example. But now really there are these we have the possibility of global conflicts and all that kind of stuff, and global solutions and all these different kind of things. So in some ways, I believe that we are both at the end and the beginning of a kind of a new world. And I don't mean a new world in necessarily a good way. I do know this. I know that the church, as I have seen it, when it is backed against the wall, when there are martyrs, when the church is persecuted, the church has a way of being most itself. Right now, I would never hope for persecutions. I would never hope, for all these things. But there's a way in which the church is itself when we look more like Christ on the cross. And so on the one hand, yes, I do think it's the end of the world, right? So it's things are changing and things are going in a bad way, and things are going so fast. I mean, look, in my own lifetime, after I graduated high school, I'll give you an example. There were anti-sodomy laws in Texas, when I was a young man, so like now the federal government says you must respect the idea of gay marriage, for example. So things are definitely changing. Things are moving from one thing to another at what feel like to me a breakneck speed. At the same time, I do think there's something that's everlasting. And, I know your catchphrase is kind of got hope, I mean, the hope I have is Christ, but it's hope in life in a crucifixion, right? It's hope in finding life and truth and goodness and beauty and joy and all of the good things out there are not incompatible with being an outsider or being incompatible with the world. Being incompatible with the world is not incompatible with truth and hope and all those good things. So I don't mean it's the end of the world as in it's time to lose hope, abandon all hope, I mean it really the other way around. I mean, like, now's the time for saints to shine, right? Now's the time for us to get ready and be prepared to embrace that cross that God has prepared for us,
Yeah. And that's a great answers. And I was just thinking, I kind of am worried about with Russia and Ukraine and all the stuff going on in the world. I definitely worry about what could happen and the potential. And if someone decides they want to get that nuke going or something like that. And then of course, China pairing up with Russia, it seems always like an us versus them. And it's interesting because I started thinking to myself about how human life is sort of distinguished by always an us versus them, and how I became way more passionate about Christianity when I found myself on social media, especially on Twitter, in sort of battles with people. And I realized I've got to get strong in my faith to understand what I'm even fighting for and about.
Right.
And I think God structured it that way. I think one of the reasons he puts all of these different mixes of people onto the planet is because he wants us to develop our strength and to know what is the truth, seek the truth, really be passionate about it.
And the reason why, we belong to, why we believe what we believe and belong to the church that we belong to is that we believe that there are certain patterns that manifest themselves in the world, in history, in the way that we interact with each other and with the world that are spoken about in the truest way in the world, in the most true way in Scripture, right? And so we can see certain things where we say, I want to make sure that I don't have the heart of the Pharisees. I want to make sure that I don't have the heart of the Sadducees, that I'm not, waiting for, some big revolution like the Zealots, or I'm not, or trying to spark the revolution myself like the Zealots, or, in the end, we recognize that at the time of Christ, all of these things that are very, very human, the very, very human way of interacting with the world, were all present at the time of Christ in Jerusalem, right? Take, all of our technological advances, all of our philosophical advances, all of our, we think of the Enlightenment as if we've taken this great leap forward, which now when we talk about the great leap forward, we might be talking about China, where millions of people were starved to death, so like we have, all of the things that we can encounter in the world today are all right there in Scripture, in a way that we can draw not just inspiration from, and not just like a moral code from, but a true faith and a hope and a way of loving that is taught to us by God Himself, right? So I do. I mean, faith is where I find my hope, for sure.
Oh, I totally agree with you on that. And so, and I'm just wondering, so what when I first kind of came back to Christianity, I kind of was a really super weak Christian for a long time, and my eyes were opened probably about 11 years ago or 12 years ago, right around there. And they were open in a bunch of different ways. But I was fascinated with how when I started studying the resurrection, I was really fascinated with how the apostles, how they were hiding when Jesus was being crucified, and then how they all came out, and Jesus and Peter had denied Jesus and all this kind of stuff. And suddenly they've got this amazing faith, and they're willing to be martyred. And a lot of people today, oh, well, Muslims are willing to be martyred. I'm like, no, it's not quite the same, because they actually saw the risen Christ.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what is the thing that you find super strong about the resurrection account?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just nailed it, right? There are people throughout history who have died for what they believe in. Tons of people who died for what they believe in. Not a whole lot of people in history who have died for what they've seen themselves, right? Who are dying for a historical fact that they witnessed. There aren't a whole lot of people like that. There's also this thing, and not to get too much in the weeds about logic and all this, but there's a kind of logic. Are you familiar with like formal logic, with modus tollens, modus ponens, all that kind of stuff? It's, so it's not exactly that, but it follows kind of that same pattern of if it weren't true, then it wouldn't be this way, right? So like that's maybe the most vague way I can put it. If all of the truths that we believe, if they weren't true, if they weren't real, why would my heart long for these things so much then, right? So there are things that people will go so far as to commit suicide over if they don't have in their life, right? If they don't have love, if they don't have truth, if they don't have beauty, right? If they don't have justice in their world, or if they don't have a sense of rightful being, which we'd call maybe like belonging, like a sense of belonging in the world, like a sense of that it's good that I am, that I exist, and all that kind of stuff. They don't have those things. This often leads people to the kind of despair that is self-destructive, right? Completely self-destructive. So what do we believe about God? We believe that God is love, and not only is He love, but He purifies love for us. He teaches us what real love is. He makes some distinctions there that make all other kinds of love, versions of love, make sense only in comparison to the one love that God is, right? Truth, same thing. If God is truth. He's truth itself. Everything that's truthful in the world has some part of God in it, and so it also explains to us what kind of truth is. So that truth is not just a sort of a proposition that matches reality. So we say that's truthful. It's more true, like the way that a thing really is authentically itself. It's truthfully itself. So I could say my students, for example, are you can say, is it true that Bobby is a Blue Jay? Right, that's our mascot, the Blue Jays. So is it true that Bobby is a Blue Jay? That's one kind of truth. Or you could say, is it true? Or you could say, Bobby is a true Blue Jay. That's a different kind of use of the word truth, and it's the second version of it, that the Hebrew word is emeth. That's what we're talking about God. When we say God is truth, that's what we mean, right? So love and truth and beauty and justice and being God's, I am the great I am. Like this is all of this stuff comes together in a way that it'll make a grown man cry, right? When you realize how this all comes together. It's so good. It's so good. And the more I embrace that, the more I understand that kind of way in which, that way in which this is summed up as the faith, right? The way in which my faith all comes together. the more I feel absolutely able to suffer for the sake of others, to suffer for the sake of truth, to suffer for the sake of beauty, to suffer for the sake of being, all those kind of, all those kind of things all come together in a way that, like, okay, take all that out. Suppose this is all just like in my imagination, right? This is all false. I wonder then, why is humankind the way that it is then? Why do we, you were on this YouTube show the other day, on The Atheist Edge.
Yeah.
Do you remember this? Right. So,
Yeah.
okay. I don't want to like argue with a guy who's not here to defend himself or anything like that. And he seemed like I got to tell you, he seemed like a very patient and he was listening intently to everything you said and all that kind of stuff. But there's a couple things I kind of wonder how he makes sense of all that. Right. So, he says there's a lot of suffering in the world, so I lose my faith because of the suffering in the world. Well, okay, that's absolutely a common reason people lose their faith. Sure. But did you ever notice that the people who are doing the suffering, not just like, hey, there's suffering in the world, but the people who are suffering themselves all turn to God the most, like go to those poor countries, go to those places where there's a terrible disaster. Go to those places where poverty is just so intense that people starve to death. Their faith is often the strongest thing that they have. Like it gives them the will to keep living. And I'm kind of wondering, like, why in the world would it be this way if there weren't something to all of this? It's hard for me to believe that throughout all of human history, it's hard for me to believe that throughout all of civilization, that all of this has been fake. all of this has been some weird, shaman priest who's just manipulated the people into believing a bunch of baloney. It's like, I just can't picture how the world gets the way that it gets without it being true, without there being some truth to what we're saying. I'm not saying I've got every single thing perfectly right. I'm open to being corrected on all kind of things I believe. And I'm sure there's some developments in my thought over time that go one way or the other, but I can't let go of such a basic human phenomenon to be able to say, nope, it's all been an illusion. We're all dust, and to dust we will return. And then that's it. I can't believe that. I can't believe that.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. And I wanted to say, just to support what you said with the suffering and the poor countries and places like that, is I think I might have mentioned this even to Atheist Edge, but if I didn't, I'll say it here. In the Globe study, they looked at 62 different societies, and they found that the ones with the highest levels of humane orientation, which is benevolence and kindness to people and in groups and out groups, are also the ones where there tends to be the most suffering or historical suffering. And the ones with the least amount of suffering historically tend to be the ones with the lowest levels of humane orientation. And the ones with the highest levels of humane orientation also are the biggest believers in God. Like in the Africa, it's like 99.9% believe in God. And it's just, so I back those points completely. I see that just like you.
Yeah, and look through history as well. Like if you want to nail down, okay, there've been like atheists throughout all of history as well, right? There've been non-believers, if you want to call them that, non-conform people who weren't conforming to the going beliefs of the day. All throughout history, there've been like these kind of individuals who kind of stand out for their what we would maybe call atheism today. But atheists or atheism as a kind of like category of people really doesn't come around until I pinpointed it in 1755. The Feast of All Souls Day in Lisbon, Portugal, there's this giant earthquake. And so everybody's in church, right? Everybody's in church, and all these churches come tumbling down on top of them. All the candles in these churches were all burning for all the souls in purgatory. So these candles catch fire to everything. Everybody that survives runs out and runs to the coast, hoping to escape the fires, And I'm sure they were all praying to Saint, to Saint Christopher to deliver them, And then this big tidal wave comes and just crashes down. And so you just have this massive death moment where all these people die. And so it's not the Portuguese who lost their faith that day. It's everybody else in Europe who looked and said, how can God let such a bad thing happen to all these very religious people? In fact, it's almost like because they were religious, because they were practicing their religion, that they died. I can't believe in God anymore. And so that's really the beginning. I believe that's kind of like the beginning of an atheist classification of people as like a group of people that you could compare to religious people or theists or whatever you want to call it. So that's 1755. There's a whole lot of centuries before that where the dominant sense of humanity was to have a sense of the real that is beyond the material, and that's just, I can't get away from that. I can't
I
get away from that.
Yeah, I can't either. And I think that kind of what you're saying is this message that I see when I started studying, especially in the last few months when I came back to Catholicism, I started studying the saints, and I noticed something that was kind of going through a pattern. I noticed that, like, when we go back to Lourdes and we have Saint Bernadette, and Mother Mary told her she would have to suffer, and it was sort of suffering. The saints are suffering to repair or make reparations
Mm-hmm.
for the sinners. And so, and it to me, that's such a difficult concept, but it's something that we consistently see.
Wow.
These saints are suffering. Mother Teresa, my gosh, all the suffering that she did over in India. And so why do you think that, why is that system like that? I know it's a really, for me, it's just a baffling question. It's so hard to think
it's
about.
a big question. And listen, there's a lot of people that have just given up on that concept, right? The prosperity gospel, so there's a lot of people who just say, like, the more you love God, the more he's going to bless your life. And by blessing your life, we mean you'll have enough money for a swimming pool and a 3-car garage and whatever, right? So there's definitely a lot of people who do not believe what you just said, right? And in fact, I think believers in what you just said, that number of people is shrinking, right? So there are fewer and fewer people who have a good, solid understanding of suffering. So why do I think it's like this? Okay, this is in a nutshell. And anybody in the comment section is free to come at me if they don't, if I skip a few steps in my logic or whatever. But you have people as a people, like it's different when you consider individuals. So I would never say one person's sin caused a hurricane or whatever, but people in general, our lack of unity with God is a problem, right? So God in his perfection and all his goodness, if there's one thing we can, atheists and Christians and everybody can agree on, is that there are things in this world that don't appear to the normal person to be ordered correctly, right? There's sin in the world. There's suffering in the world. Whether you don't like to call it sin or not, everybody agrees there are things in the world that are just no good. And a lot of that is our fault, right? A lot of that is the way we treat one another and the way that the desires that we have. So even the Buddhists will even say this, right? All suffering begins with desire, right? And our desires are disordered. Our desires are all goofed up, right? So here we are just in the mess we're in. I think that's undeniable, right? That we're in a mess. And then the way that God fixes this mess is without coming in and forcing us all to act the right way, which is the real way to act the right way is to love. And you can't be forced to love or else it's not love anymore, right? So God, rather than, finding some fix that would make us not ourselves anymore, God becomes one of us, right? It's kind of genius, right? He becomes one of us and fills that and sanctifies that by touching all those different parts of what it means to be human, right? For a long time, people believed that if you touched something that was bad, the badness was contagious and you became unclean if you touched something that was unclean. Well, it really works the opposite way with Christ. He comes in, and because he's so clean, in a sense, because he's so holy, his holiness is contagious, right? So he brings his holiness into humanity. He brings his holiness into the womb. He brings his holiness into a cave. He brings his holiness into a manger. He brings his holiness into childhood and adulthood and working as a carpenter. And he brings his holiness into all these different parts of being human, which include, in the end, very bad suffering and even death itself, right? So I believe this is the way that things are corrected. They're not corrected by saying, I'm going to take it and turn it into something it's not. It's like, I'm going to take it and sanctify those spaces where living in those spaces can be redemptive, right? Can fix the problem. So I think that when we talk about suffering, it's not that we ever sit here, we hope, that there's more suffering. What we need is more suffering. Sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes we need suffering to correct us, to correct our attitudes or whatever. We all know that from being a child. If you never correct a child, he'll grow up feral, But there's this other side of us too, that even holy people suffer. And every time I run into somebody who I just know that this person is extremely holy, they've been great sufferers. They've been great sufferers, for the sake of other people, been carrying crosses for the sake of other people. And I think that's it. That's the plan. That's the worldview,
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And yeah, just going back to Jesus, what it's the idea of the person who did not deserve it. taking the sin for the person or the people who do deserve it. And so, I mean, I'd say not people in the chat don't want to think that they deserve suffering. No one wants to think you deserve suffering, but in some ways, yeah, the people who are that. I wanted to ask you another question that might be kind of coming out of left field here in sort of a way, because you mentioned Jesus and his birth and all of that. One of my friends who have had on this channel a couple of times is a very liberal Christian, like super liberal, progressive, I guess you could call him. And he's questioned the whole story of Jesus when he was 12 and how Mary and Joseph were trying to find him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple and they were a little distraught. And I'm wondering, and I have different ways of looking at that, but I'm curious to hear what, as a priest, how you kind of view that whole story. Because he thought it wasn't very good that Jesus did that, because he said if his kids disappeared for 3 days, that was the point.
All right. Well, okay. So it all depends on perspective, right? So look, I think Joseph is a saint amongst saints, right? And Mary is, she's a saint, but it's like a saint in a way that's hard to even comprehend in all the ways in which Mary is saintly, right? And without sin and all this kind of stuff. So I don't think that they were in the wrong for feeling the stress of not knowing where their boy is, right? I don't think they're wrong for coming up to the situation and saying like, hey, from my perspective, I don't know where my son is for a few days, and this is not good. From Jesus's perspective, there is a process of him. So Jesus is like us in all ways but sin. So one of the ways in which we are what we are is we grow, right? We mature. We come to sort of add on to things, right? So we become bigger over time, right? So Jesus in his humanity is way ahead of everybody else, but not so far ahead of everybody else that he encompassed all of the things that his parents would have wanted him to encompass at that moment, right? So Jesus is there in the temple talking with these men who were learned and all that sort of thing. And for Christ, that's what he's there to do. That's what he's there to do, all those things. And like a lot of young people, he did what he thought was right at the time, and not just what he thought was right, what was right in a lot of ways. But you can't blame Mary and Joseph from their perspective, from a totally different perspective, for saying what in the world's going on, Now, why? I think the more interesting question is, why did the gospel writers take that story and no other story from Jesus' childhood? So we go from his birth to his public ministry, and we get that one story in there, is that Jesus was ahead of his time in terms of, like, he was impressive as a youth, a very impressive person as a youth. But Mary and Joseph exercised their parental authority over him in a way that tamps down the visibility of all that, which I think is proper, right? So Jesus himself, for example, they go to, I forget exactly what passage this is in, but Jesus is preaching and the crowd is talking about wanting to throw him off the side of a cliff and all this stuff. And Jesus knows it's not his time. So what is he doing? Jesus is conforming to the liturgical calendar of the year. It wasn't Passover. It wasn't time for him to be sacrificed. It wasn't time for, so his time is a time that fulfills all the good things. So it fulfills a liturgical calendar and religious practice of a people whose time has reached its end, and for something new to begin, a covenant which has reached its fulfillment in Christ. And so Jesus is conforming, and in the same way that he became human to be with us, he also became human, the kind of human that ought to obey the liturgical calendar, that ought to obey their parents, that ought to, be all the things that it means to be human. And so I think that's what's happening there. And that's why the writers of the Gospels include that story and don't include a whole lot of other stories, is because it's almost like the reason for the silence is in the one story where they're not silent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I see that too. And I also was thinking the significance of the 3 days, because it's also like when Jesus was crucified,
sure.
3 days passed, they had to trust in their faith. They had to really strengthen their faith that in him. And then all of a sudden, boom, he's there. And so.
Sure. Yeah, without a doubt. The story is very rich with symbols and all these other things. And really, Jesus' whole life is that. Jesus' entire life is rich with these symbols, and there's symbols that get pointed to from the very beginning, from the stories of creation, right? From the stories of creation. So I know that there are going to be a lot of people who say, how can anybody take Genesis seriously? Well, okay, because it's so right, right? Because it's, no, I would say you got to take Genesis seriously because it's so truthful in its expression of reality, right? I don't want to go off the deep end about this too much, but I love watching sort of science documentaries and all this kind of stuff. This stuff fascinates me. But we all know that at some point, scientists everywhere or people everywhere believe that the Earth was the center of the world, right? And that everything revolved around Earth in some kind of way. And then at some point they said, it's not really like that. It's more like the sun is the center, or the kind of Copernican revolution in Galileo. The sun is the center, heliocentrism, right? The sun is the center of everything. And we rotate around it. We go around it. Not long after that, they say, well, actually, it's not the sun that's the center of everything. It's maybe it's maybe the center of our galaxy, right? And so the path of the Earth is not, the Earth is still and everything goes around it. The path isn't that. It's the sun is moving. I'm trying to do this in the camera, right? The sun is moving and the Earth is going around it. So you wind up with kind of like a corkscrew motion, right? And we say, oh, look, we really get it now. The Earth is moving like a corkscrew. Okay, then we do our math a little bit more precisely, and we realize it's not a corkscrew because the sun is moving not perfectly straightforward. The sun itself is like sliding to the side because it's part of a galaxy that's rotating, right? And so really it's not like a corkscrew. It's more like a cartwheel. So there's occasional times when the movement of the Earth relative to the center of the universe, the movement of the Earth is practically sitting still while everything else kind of flies around it. It's almost like doing like a cartwheel, and then our whole galaxy is not just rotating. Our whole galaxy is also flying through the universe away from the center of the universe. And so we kind of have this really, really complex math to show how crazy the actual path of the center of the Earth is compared to the center of the universe. And at some point I say, who cares, right? Does this mean anything at all to anybody? Like I could care more about the number of grains of salt in the salt shaker on my table. Like it just doesn't matter. At some point it's not practical. It doesn't matter. And I'm impressed with the math, and I'm impressed with scientists who achieve these heights of calculation and of knowledge of the physical world. I guess we can be impressed with that. It's a human achievement. But in the end, I don't think I'm any closer to any truth at all by knowing the actual path of the Earth as compared to the center of the universe since the Big Bang and all that stuff. Like at some point, that's not what matters. Genesis doesn't care at all that you understand that fact. Not at all. What it wants you to understand is that there's this plan that God unfolds in the creation of the world. And that plan includes, the whole creation of the world happens in 6 days, but it includes a remainder. It includes an extra day, that seventh day that he calls the day of rest. And it calls it the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day is like that extra piece in there that doesn't fit into the regular 6 days of creation. Right. So what's happening here is what that is saying is that there's, for all of us, we have a plan in our own lives. Right. So I build my house, I build my business, I build my everything 6 days a week. But that seventh day, I don't put any effort into my own plans. I let God take over that seventh day and I give that to God. What that also means is there can be moral plans that say, thou shalt not do this and thou shalt do this. And you have all these moral plans that are laid out, but there's still that remainder at the end. And that remainder is going to be where forgiveness has to happen. Like you don't get forgiveness unless you have things that don't fit into the plan called sin, right? You don't get forgiveness unless you have that remainder. I'm going on and saying a lot of things, but like that's all there in Scripture from the very beginning. The story of creation is mapping everything out for us in a way that I find so true. I have a hard time even imagining a world in which that isn't true, even though it doesn't match what scientists tell us about the movement of the planets and the sun and the formation of the world and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, I think fantastic answer. I love the idea, like what you're saying. And I know we have I want to say hi to people in the chat. Just welcome everybody. Gary, Taking Back Eden. I saw Bread of Life. That's my friend Rebecca, and I saw Susan. So we've got some people in the chat, some great people. Hallelujah is the one who introduced me to you. So she's not
all
here.
over.
Yeah, it doesn't look like she's here, but she'll probably listen in later. So if she's listening in later, hi. But I know we have a few atheists or at least one atheist in the chat. I see him. His Gary. Welcome, Gary. And
Gary Priestley. Good morning.
I wanted to, since you mentioned the cosmos, and to me, God always said in Romans and in other places, we can just look into the cosmos, we can look into nature and find evidence, general evidence for God. And I'm thinking that one thing that you kind of reminded me of is the North Star, and how apparently it's really 3 stars, and the stars have always been used to guide people. And I think, I mean, strange little funny coincidences like that. I don't know. Have you given any thought to that, or looked and noticed the way that light pollution is something that's really affected our views of what the stars look like even?
Yeah. I mean, look, you know, what you're doing, drawing inspiration from these stars, which have throughout history been practically synonymous with angels, right? Messengers of God, right? That of course people would look at stars, they would see connections, and different cultures saw different things in the stars and all that. The ancient Romans didn't really believe in anything like astrology until just a couple of hundred years before Christ, or they would, maybe some people believed in it, but they kind of thought this is kind of crazy folk stuff, you know. But by the time Christ arrives on the scene, there are wise men from the East that are using the stars as a way of understanding what God is doing in the world. And so I can't help but think that yeah, absolutely. Now, I rather than our scientific knowledge of the stars kind of you know, destroying that outlook, I think what we're really getting is it maybe explaining a lot of why things, you know, the mechanics of it all, insofar as what we know is true. I mean, 175 years ago, people could have swore there was a planet called Vulcan, right? Which now we know doesn't exist. But our best instruments, our best scientists were all excited to talk about this planet that was close to the sun called Vulcan. That doesn't even exist, you know. So scientific discovery and then like retraction of those discoveries, that happens all the time, right? So this is like, to me, that just happens at a very different plane of existence, and a completely different kind of knowledge that is not, for me, the highest form of knowledge, right? So the knowledge of the practical material world, while it's very important, and look, we're using all this technology just to talk right now on the internet, but like what we're saying is so much more important than the technology behind the conveyance of those messages, right? So I feel the same way about the stars, right? So like I find that it's a modern problem, literally a like modernity, a problem for modernity, that we think of knowledge of the material world as a higher kind of knowledge than ancient wisdom, right? This is if you want to go back to philosophy again, Descartes kind of draws this big distinction. And then from then on, he's like, you know, the whole idea of we should question everything. This is part of this comes out of Descartes, you know, Cartesian thought. We should question everything. And what we mean is question everything so that we can get down to the bottom of the material world. That's very much like Gnosticism, right? Like the more we know about the facts, the better off we are, even if those facts aren't applied in a way that's actually going to make us more like God, right? Not going to bring us to unity with God. Well, then I don't want to say what good are those facts. I know they're good, but to me, that's just a very different order of thinking. The same way that I don't wake up in the morning as I'm watching the sunrise and I think, wow, the path of the earth through the universe is like a sideways skidding corkscrew, you know, like I'm thinking, no, let the sun come up, you know, and well, I'm going to watch it go down tonight. And, you know, like that's the world we actually live in. That's the way we actually interact with the world. I find that to be infinitely more valuable than, I feel bad. There's so many Jesuit scientists who are probably like biting their tongue right now. There's so many Jesuit scientists who are hating what I'm saying, but I really do believe that there's a way in which science has become like the new Gnosticism, you know?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting answer. I also want to say hi to Kevin, non-traditional Catholic. I had him on my
I know that
channel.
guy. I say I know him. I mean, we've exchanged emails a couple times. For the longest time, I've been trying to find a way to chat with the guy, but we haven't done that. I need to do that.
Yeah, I just got on his channel, and he's going to come on my channel and talk about Marian apparitions in a couple weeks. So that should be a lot of fun.
Awesome. No, that should be live. Yeah.
So I'm also wondering if you had to pick a favorite miracle that Jesus performed, what would be your favorite miracle of his many miracles?
Oh, I don't know that I've ever thought about that. I might, you know, for me, I guess for me, it's always like what's happening liturgically with the church right now, right? And you know, lately I've been thinking a lot about what it means for the fringe of Jesus's garment, where the woman with the hemorrhage touches the fringe of Jesus's garment, and all of the richness that is involved and the symbols that are involved in the telling of that story, that I think are just absolutely fantastic, right? The fringe of the garment is the equivalent of the seventh day, the Sabbath, right? So it's like you have your garment woven according to a plan. It's perfectly laid out. It's perfectly planned. And you have to like calculate how many times this thread is going to cross over those other threads that are moving in that direction. And it takes an engineer to lay out a garment if you're going to get the pattern to show up right in that garment. And then God prescribes, he tells people they have to leave fringes at the end. So for all of your plans, for all of your engineered thought that goes into building something like a garment, you need fringes hanging off the end, right? So whenever this woman reaches out and she just touches that fringe, and that's where she's healed, like that just tells me, wow, if I want to be anything like Christ, I cannot try to squeeze everything into my plan. I've got to recognize that God operates in a way that's always going to be surprising, that's going to always be unplanned for, that's always going to be on the margins. For that's where God's greatest work happens, you know.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer too. And I haven't even thought, I mean, I wouldn't have thought of that miracle. I was thinking of walking on water and
That's pretty great.
Yeah, that's
that ain't bad
cool.
either.
Like, how did he do that? Like, I've tried, it doesn't work.
That's why they call it a miracle, right? So I mean, part of what I think we need to do as a people, right, as a culture, is define more correctly what a miracle even is, right? So for the kind of working definition I have for a miracle is something that is unexpected, like completely unexpected. So you can do scientific experiments that when you start repeating those experiments, no matter what's happening in that experiment, it's not a miracle if it's repeating, right? So it becomes expected that these chemical changes are going to happen. So it's not right to call that a miracle, right? But a miracle's got to, number one, be unexpected. And number two, it's got to point to some truth greater than itself, right? So the woman who's healed of her hemorrhage, hey, she still died, right? she's still like, so like, great, she stopped, bleeding, but then like a few years, and here we are 2,000 years later, we care more about her stopping to bleed for a few years than we care the fact that she died, right? So like the miracle itself of having the blood stop is not what's so fantastic, right? It's not so like outrageous, but it is something that was completely unexpected, but it points to something greater. It points to the fact that God works in those fringes, on those marginal cases, right? That's where God is most obvious. We do a lot of work. We do a lot of serious work for those 6 days, but that seventh day that belongs to God, that's where he's special. Well, he's special in the fringe. You can find God at the fringe in more visceral ways sometimes. And so to me, that's where, when we talk about miracles, I always want to know, okay, number one so sometimes we say like, oh, the miracle of life. Like, yeah, okay. Maybe like the first time life appears on the planet, first time you get life was certainly unexpected. We can't even reproduce that in a lab somewhere, but it's certainly unexpected. But what I'm really looking for are those things that are unexpected and they point to something greater, right? Something much greater.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I wanted to say, I also heard a little nugget on Reason and Theology's channel that you said, so I wanted to go back to it because I really liked it. He actually isolated it and he put it in his own little video, but
Okay.
It was his video of Ash Wednesday, and it was talking about Ozymandias and about, I think it was Percy Shelley.
Yeah, Percy Shelley, sure.
Do you want to share that a little bit? Because I like that story. I thought that was really
sure. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about my fascination with the work of what I consider very good atheists, in the sense that they're very good at achieving what they're aiming to achieve, right? So I like to read atheist poets, atheist artists, atheist philosophers. I really enjoy that. I really like doing that, and it's not because I'm seduced by the ideas they're putting forward. It's more like, I describe it as like, it's more like watching a good horror movie now and then, right? It's like you're watching something and something's wrong here, something's broken, and you're often sort of like cheering for the characters in a horror movie, saying, like run, don't go into that closet, or don't go into the basement, or don't go walking down that street. You just like, you cheer for people to get away from the danger, So like when I'm reading these atheists, a lot of times I'm saying like, man, look at the terrible idea this is, but it's so well expressed that it's like I'm steel manning the outlook, the argument, or whatever. So Ozymandias is written by Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley died young. He died like 29 years old in a boating accident, right? But he wrote this poem about, it's called Ozymandias. And if you really want to hear the best version of this being read, the actor from Breaking Bad, Ralph Cranston might be his name, something like that. He reads it on the internet. You can search Breaking Bad Ozymandias, and you can hear him read that poem, and it's so good. Like his voice is perfect for it. But it essentially says, to sum it all up, that out there in the desert, in this land that at one time apparently had lots of culture, lots of superstition, lots of things that seemed important at the time, somebody had a statue made of the king. The king had a statue made of himself, and it was huge and it was impressive. But now it has toppled to the ground. Now there's nothing left, right? It's all just pieces and parts scattered on the ground. So this once great king is now, his time is over. And on the pedestal of the statue, it still says, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. And then he says, nothing remains, right? So Ozymandias wants people to say, no matter how good I think I am, I'm never going to compare to Ozymandias, That's what Ozymandias wants you to see. But in fact, what you do see is even the great King of Kings, Ozymandias, is now rubble and dust and sand. And so I'm going to despair for a very different reason, not because Ozymandias is great, but because even he has returned to dust. And so I will despair because of that, right? So that's like so true if it weren't for Christ, right? that is such a completely true thing, that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. End of story. But we believe in Christ, where, we were made from dust, and to dust we shall return. And God will put meat back on top of those dry bones. God will resurrect us. And God, that we believe in we have this hope-filled future because we saw it happen in Christ. We saw Christ die as a convicted criminal, crucified on a cross in the worst kind of way. We saw him buried and put into a tomb and shut the door. It's over. And then we saw that door opened, and we saw an empty tomb. And we saw a resurrected Christ. And if that doesn't change your outlook on the future, nothing will, So that's my takeaway from Ozymandias for sure.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's because it's fascinating. And I think also just the ancient kings, the way that they bragged about themselves was kind of amusing. I went to my dean's office and I look over in the corner and I see he's got this cylinder, and it was a remake cylinder of King Cyrus's cylinder. And I said to him, because he happens to be from, I think his background is Iranian. And so I said to him, is that King Cyrus's? Is that his cylinder Cyrus? And he's like, yes. How'd you know? And
yeah.
I'm like, because it was a big bragging thing. He's almost like the Donald Trump of
right. They all were. Like it's really something. Some of these guys from back then. It's really impressive the way that they're sort of like, I feel like it's like our most like humanity magnified, right? When you see some of these people who haven't been yet sort of like influenced by the Christian influence. Like, people don't realize how much the presence of Christianity in the world has rewritten the book for culture in general, right? For culture in general. Christianity has left its mark on the world, even in non-Christian places. So it's really something.
Yeah, the whole idea of human dignity. I think that's something definitely that was, because think about in Roman times, they would leave these people out in the streets if they were female babies. Maybe they didn't want them, so they would just leave them out to rot in the sun. It was terrible. So the Christians really, and I would recommend that if you haven't read that, Tom Holland's book Dominion on that kind of stuff.
I haven't read that, but I've heard so many people have told me I need to read that. I do need to get to that. Yeah. So I guess the imperative here too, though, is that knowing how influential Christianity is, and knowing how when people latch onto, they become saints and all this kind of stuff. Be careful, because when Christians behave badly, it's like there's nothing worse, right? It's like there's nothing worse than Christians behaving badly. We've done more harm to the world. More harm has been done to the world by Christians, because not only is the damage they've done bad, but the damage to the reputation of Christ. And people are sometimes unable to appreciate Christianity because of the bad things Christians have done. I think people aren't really even when you run into people who have rejected Christianity, they're almost never rejecting Christianity. They're rejecting the Christians that they've met or read about. And it's like, I don't blame them. Some of the Christians we've had have done such a poor job of imitating Christ that I don't blame them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I know we probably are coming up on 10 o'clock here, my time, I guess 9 o'clock your time. So I know we have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you before I forget, though, one thing I was just been but I haven't heard you say anything about this, so I don't know. Have you looked into C.S. Lewis or read any of C.S. Lewis's works?
When I was young, I read a lot of C.S. Lewis. So, like as a kid, I loved the Chronicles of Narnia and that sort of stuff. As a younger man, I read a lot of his other stuff. So, like The Great Divorce and the Screw Tape Letters, that sort of thing. And then recently, I read The Discarded Image. And it's like, I feel like God has laid out the works of C.S. Lewis in the perfect order for me. The Discarded Image is one of my favorite books. So if it's not one of his most well-known works, but like
I've never heard of it. What's it about?
Absolutely. Well, it's his understanding of medieval thought and mythology, and how he, sort of like how to understand a lot of what has come before us in terms of that sort of work, right? So, he helps you understand how people used to understand the movement of the stars, how people used to understand angels and demons, how people used to understand a lot of the things that we've lost contact with in our modern age, with the effects of the Enlightenment. The effects the Enlightenment have had on all of us. So he calls it the discarded image, meaning like we don't think this way anymore, but there's a lot there that we maybe shouldn't have discarded. And I think that it's fantastic. It's absolutely great. So if you're a grown person and you want to read a C.S. Lewis book that isn't maybe written for children or something like that, the discarded image is what I would strongly suggest.
I'm going to go out and get that because I never even heard of that book. I've read a ton of C.S. Lewis, and all the Googling that I've done for C.S. Lewis books, that one never even popped up, I don't think.
It's not a super well-known work, but boy, do I like it.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's good. So is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience today?
Well, be nice to one another on YouTube. Be nice to one another on YouTube. I think people think that that sort of like anonymity behind the screen, that it means that you can just be your worst self and it doesn't matter. But don't be that way, right? Like I think that more and more we're going to find this sort of digital platform as the way we interact with each other. So I've been feeling a whole lot lately that we need to start behaving as we would in person when we're online, and that would be my strongest piece of advice. Is that just be kind to one another, and I think you'll find, you'll find interactions very fruitful when you do that, and in the end, submit yourself to the will of God who made you and who knows you better than you know yourself. So.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I totally agree with you. Now I've been on Twitter very actively since 2015, every day tweeting. And so I decided I have to give that up for Lent. So no tweets from me. This is so hard for me. It's so hard.
Well, I've never been on Twitter, but the way people talk about it makes me think I'm not missing much.
Well, it's like those little dopamine rush that I get when I get on Twitter, I tweet something. I had to give it up. It's just that had to happen. And so, there is a lot of nastiness on there, unfortunately. And I was kind of nasty when I first got on there because I had these, I had sort of animosity against some of the people who were nasty towards me, and I'd return it kind of with a hit. And so I've been working on that for many years now, trying to be as good of a person as possible. But it's a challenge. I mean, being online is a challenge. So I have to agree with you there. Yeah. So what does your day look like today?
So here in New Orleans, high schools get an entire week off for Mardi Gras. So there aren't any classes today or anything like that. So it's a whole lot of catching up. It's a whole lot of meetings with people that they've been on holiday, so like the adults that I interact with. So from construction crews to, attorneys to teachers to, that sort of stuff. So it's usually a day filled with those kind of things whenever we don't have a lot of students here at school.
Wow, that's great. I didn't know that is quite a celebration, Mardi Gras.
So everybody gets off for a week.
That is amazing. We get off here for the Strawberry Festival for one day. We
a
week off, but what about? Do you have a YouTube channel? Is there? I didn't.
I do. Yeah. So if you just search
find that
Father John Brown SJ, like so as you see my name typed out there, FRJOHNBROWN SJ. So right now I am putting up every single day a little homily for kind of a little reflection based on the readings for the Mass that day. They're going to be between 3 and 7 minutes long every day. And people are free to look at it. I am not a Catholic YouTuber. I do not depend on YouTube for any kind of income. I don't have a Patreon. I'm never going to have a Patreon or anything like that. So, save your support for people who are doing that for a living. And I'm not looking to increase subscribers exactly, but if you like it, the best way to find out when I have another video, which are kind of intermittent, is to subscribe that way. So hopefully people like some of the content there.
I am definitely going to go subscribe. So you have at least one new subscriber, and I see there
Oh,
Kevin,
fantastic.
non-traditional Catholic, he's going to subscribe too, he says.
Oh, great.
So,
Great,
so I'm going
great.
to put a link to your YouTube channel in the description, so for
Awesome. Thank you.
ease of finding that. So thank you so much for coming on, Father John. Really
Thank you.
appreciate
Sorry
it.
about getting cut off yesterday, but just as the conversation was getting good, we had a good time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it too. It was wonderful. And so thank you. And I hope to have you back on again. And I thank you for sharing so much wisdom today. I'm going to listen to this video again just to make sure I digested everything that you said. And
It
so
was fun. I appreciate it. Thank you.
thank you. Have a good day. Everybody, just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God.
Amen.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to end this.
All right. Bye-bye.